This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Duell. If you're like many Ed Reps who play a wind or percussion instrument, and string instruments are just a bit of a mystery, or maybe you're familiar with string instruments and you just want to brush up on your terminology and string knowledge, this episode is for you. We're going to go over the different parts of the string instruments, talk about their proper names, their function, what they're made of, and why those parts are important. Building your knowledge on string instruments will lead to more confidence in talking with string players and teachers, and more confidence will lead to more rentals and sales. I'm joined by Jason Heath, String Product Manager of Eastman. Jason, welcome.
Hey, Shane, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to do something that I think is probably a little tricky. We're going to talk about something that is much easier to do when you have a violin, for example, in front of you to point things out. So we're going to do this completely in audio. So I think maybe the best format is, Jason, I'm going to give you a part, and you'll tell me what it does and what
Sounds
it's made
good.
of. How's that?
Sounds great, but I might have to ask for your advice too, because you, though trumpet is your instrument, you know an awful lot about the string world and are quite eloquent in describing it. So I will give it my try, but we might have to work on a couple of them together.
All right. Thank you. I'll do my best. So let's start with kind of the heart of any string instrument, and that would be the body, the tone woods of the instruments. So let's start with the top of the instrument. If you're looking at the instrument, it's going again, very basic. The top has the F holes in it. You can see the bridge sitting on top of it. It's the varnished top of the instrument. Jason, what's that made of, and why is it important?
Yeah, it is. It really is the heart and soul of the stringed instrument, and it is made of spruce in almost every case. Spruce is just a great tone wood. Is the word we use to describe woods that we use for wooden instruments, string instruments. And spruce has this just great set of qualities where it is a resonant wood. When carved right, it has great projection. It has great tone color, but it also will stand up to the pressures of having the strings and bridge, which we'll get to all that, and just that pressure that's put on it. So it's the heart of the instrument. It's the thing that more than anything else, in my opinion, determines the overall tone.
Oh, super important part of that instrument then. Mm-hmm. So the holes that are in the top, they're called F holes. Why are they shaped that way, and what do they do?
Good question, and I might need your help on this one because I know that the sound comes out of them. There's a lot going on in the string world, and really any instrument that's the result of tradition. It may or may not be the most acoustically perfect way to do it, and people have actually played around with that hole and changed the size of the F hole or the shape of the F hole. But this is the same. What you see on 99%, or more than that probably, of bowed string instruments, that is the same type of F hole that's been used for 400 years at this point. So it is what allows the sound to escape the instrument.
Yeah, and it's kind of a signature too. If you look at the top of a violin made by Antonio Stradivari or Guarneri del Gesù, they look different. They have their kind of signature look to them. And even today at Eastman, when we make a instrument in the pattern of a Strad violin or the pattern of a Guarneri violin, which is inspired by those makers, the F holes look different. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So while we're on the top, you have these black stripes going around the edges. What are those things?
You're talking about the purfling, right?
Right.
Okay. So first of all, it looks pretty. It's a really cool design. Mm-hmm. It's one of the few, we're relatively conservative in variations in the bowed string world, but there are different types of purfling, and it looks cool. It gives a certain elegance to the instrument, but what it also does is protect those edges, because if you knock your violin, your bass, your whatever into a chair or a stand or something like that, and a crack starts to form, that crack is not going to spread it's not going to be as likely, rather, to spread. That purfling acts as a sort of barrier, and you don't want your stringed instruments cracking, and you especially don't want big old cracks forming. So the purfling, while pretty, also adds some protection.
Yeah, protection is key there. And sometimes that purfling is, well, first of all, it's made of a really hard wood. It's a sandwich of ebony, and there's another middle layer, like I think birch or maple or something like that, and there's another layer of ebony. So it's actually a sandwich of wood. They carve a groove into the top and the back, and they actually put this into the wood and then carve the excess off. So it's actually really hard wood. On cheap instruments, you'll find that is paint, literally paint, that they'll put on like $100 instruments off of a cheap internet site. And that paint obviously will provide zero protection. The one caveat is if it's a cello, a laminate cello or a laminate bass, it is paint, because laminate is plywood and it doesn't need that protection. It's got its own protection built in. But if it's a solid instrument from Eastman, then it is actually real ebony purfling, which is a very important part for protection of the instrument. And like Jason said, it doesn't allow cracks as easily to go through. Think of it as like a bumper almost. Yeah. All right, so if we go down to the sides of the instrument, ribs is another word for those sides. If you want to sound like a string player, call them ribs as opposed to the sides. But what are those made of, Jason?
Those are generally made of maple. And so the spruce and maple are the two woods to keep in mind. For most string instruments, the majority of string instruments, and especially after you get out of that very basic student level for cello and bass, you're looking at maple for the ribs, also the back. We'll get to that, and then spruce for the top. And what the ribs do is they give the instrument some dimension to it. You've got this wooden box that you are creating sounds with using the strings, and the ribs determine how deep the resonating cavity is. So they're incredibly important. They also provide some structure for the instrument. They do not contribute to the resonance of the instrument nearly as much as the top. They do, and it matters how you shape them, how thin or thick they are, the quality of maple, but it's less important than the top. But they provide structure, they provide depth to the resonating cavity, and maple is the material that's used.
Okay, great. And let's keep going around the instrument. The back. I think you've mentioned it already, but what is that back made of, and why is it important?
Right, also maple, and that along with the ribs and top, there you've got your instrument right there. You've got the resonating cavity, like I said, and it can be one piece of maple, it can be two frequently, and especially as you get into the bigger instruments, the quality of the wood, all of that contributes to how much the instrument rings and resonates and what the quality of the sound is. So, Yep, maple for the ribs, maple for the back, spruce for the top, and those are the nuts and bolts of the stringed instrument.
All right, and those are the things we call tone woods. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is they're the same species of woods that have been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. It really hasn't changed. And I'm curious, Jason, as you go through, say, the Eastman line from your basic beginning instruments, like in your Model 80s, and you go up through the line to our 928s, as we call them, the Emilianis, it's still the same species of wood. So what really is changing in the woods?
Yeah, I like to use the analogy of like, if you think of a camera, you have like the cheapest possible camera, which will still take a photo, but then as you get into these higher levels, all of a sudden you just have more to work with. So the wood, even though it's all the same wood, all wood is not created equal. Where it grows contributes a lot to it, and there are a few regions in the world that are just particularly well suited for this spruce, for this maple. That contributes a lot. How long you age the wood contributes a lot. We age wood for a series of years, and obviously that takes space and time, and it's a whole process. But that contributes a lot to it. And then how you craft the instrument, how you actually carve the top and the ribs and the back, the exact thickness and thinness, the expertise of the craftsperson, that contributes tremendously. And then we have another element that I know we will get to, actually, the varnish, and that's a complicated topic for sure. So even though we're looking at the same building materials, the quality of those materials, how they've been treated, and the overall craftsmanship, they just massively impact the quality of the instrument.
Okay, thank you. So one thing we didn't talk about was the varnish that goes over all of this body of the instrument. What's the function of the varnish?
The varnish, it serves to protect the wood over time. It has multiple functions. It's pretty, for one thing, but more importantly, it helps protect the instrument, and it also helps to, and particularly as we get into the higher end varnishes, it helps to enhance the resonant qualities of the wood. And it's one of these sort of mysterious artisanal processes that have been passed down over generations. Depending on whether we're talking about a student instrument or a step-up instrument or getting more into the advanced professional instruments, the type of varnish you use has more and more of an effect on the actual resonance and tone quality of the instrument as you get into those higher levels of instrument.
Okay, great. Thank you. So obviously the tone woods, the body of the instrument, it's hollow. So let's go on the inside of the instrument and discover what's in there. So you have something holding these all together called the blocks. Where are they, and what are they made of?
Yeah, they're at all these important structural points. So you have up by the neck, you have a block, and then down by the button, and we'll get to more of these terms, but the opposite side from where all the strings are attached up top, that we have a block there. At all the corners of the instruments where you'll see them sort of come to a point, there are blocks there too. And Shane, you might need to help me out on the materials of the blocks.
They're a softwood, actually, a spruce.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Yeah, of course they are, because they do have a lighter quality to them. Because with a string instrument, you don't want to have more mass than you need. That's sort of a general rule with strings. We want to have this be as resonant and free as possible, so we don't want to bulk up the instrument unnecessarily. But those blocks are points where they're really important for structure.
They hold it all together.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can't really see them unless you've seen an instrument with the top off. Then you can see where all these blocks are, but they are super important. They hold it literally together.
Yeah.
So there's also something that's a little tricky to see, and that's the bass bar. Mm-hmm. You can't really see it unless you really look under there. It's attached to the bottom side of the top. What does that do?
Yeah, and I was always confused. I thought that bass bars were only in basses. And then I thought, like, oh, what, really? There are bass bars in these other instruments? They help they help provide a bit of structure, but they really help transmit the vibrations throughout the entire top. They vary depending on the maker of the instrument. They can vary a bit in length, in width, in overall shape.
Yeah, watching it done in our workshop, it looks like a really skilled thing to do. I mean, you have to carve it just the right shape so it perfectly fits into the top of the instrument, give it a little tension, and it's glued down. It's really a fascinating thing to watch. So you also have this peg-looking thing under the bridge. What is that?
Yeah, it's a disturbingly important piece of hardware for the instrument called the sound post. And the sound post it has a few roles. It is structural. That post needs to be there, but it's the closest thing we have to a tone knob on the stringed instrument. And there's kind of a whole art to getting this in the exact right place, but you can make the sound brighter, darker, bigger in some cases, kind of more loose or tight. These are a little bit subjective terms, but where that sound post is placed and the length of that post and all sorts of things like that determine to a great extent the tone of that instrument. Now, what it's made out of and how it's varnished and how it's crafted, those are the things that you really can't change once the instrument's done, but that sound post placement is crucial. And the bigger the instrument, the more variance you're going to have on that as the climate changes. And that's a whole other topic we can get into. But the bigger the instrument in the string world, the more variance you're going to have as things get more or less humid or warmer or cooler. So you have to mess around with that sound post increasingly more as you get into the bigger instruments.
Okay. As a bass player yourself, do you have yours adjusted fairly often?
Well, now that I moved out to San Francisco, California, where it's 58 degrees every single day, I never have it adjusted because it's always the same. Back when I lived in Chicago, and it would be negative 20, sometimes in the winter, and then 80 in the summer. Yeah, I had to have most bass players in areas of the world that have an actual winter, as we think of it. They have what's called a winter post and a summer post. And when the heat goes on, is the general rule of thumb, you go in and get your winter post put in. And when the heat goes off, vice versa. And when you need that post switched, because your instrument all of a sudden starts to feel terrible.
Really?
And you can actually, yeah.
You feel it in the playability of it.
It just feels like something's weird, like something's loose, something's wrong. Your tone goes away or gets really constrained, and so that's one of those things that people in luthiers and shops get a lot of business right around when the heat goes on and the heat goes off, with double basses in particular.
So the sound post is a big deal.
Yes.
Yeah, I've seen instruments transform by a luthier just changing the sound post a little bit. It went from a customer not really liking the instrument as much to, wow, this is a great instrument. Just by literally like a couple little taps on the sound post to move it a millimeter one way, and it changes the instrument. It's really remarkable. It's like playing with the treble and bass knob.
Yeah.
Let's go to the very top of the instrument. The curly Q looking thing that's literally at the very top, the scroll. What's that made of, and what's it do?
So the scroll itself, that's all maple. And it's one of those funny things that do we need that curly Q shape on the instrument? Not really, but it's so baked into the tradition of stringed instruments that it's on pretty much every instrument. I have seen more experimental instruments that change the shape of that, and that can be interesting, but it's just so much in the culture of string playing that you just see that shape. And that shape, it has a minimal or pretty much no impact on the tone of the instrument, but it really affects the aesthetic beauty of the instrument. And even though you might think that shape is the same on every single violin, viola, cello, or bass, there are variations depending on the luthier who does it and how wide or narrow those curly scroll parts are, and the craftsmanship on it. It says a lot. It's kind of like a luthier's stamp on that instrument. Okay,
so it's really just there to be pretty.
It's there to be pretty.
Okay.
Yep.
There's nothing wrong with that. So just below the scroll, you have where all the pegs are going in and the strings are kind of all jammed up in there. What do you call that?
Right. This is a much more functional part of the instrument. It's called the peg box. And that's where, everything goes in, and that's where the strings get connected. One of the ends on which the strings get connected. That is how you tune the instrument in that peg box. And it's extremely functional and important part of the instrument.
Okay. So you as a bass player have a very different looking set of pegs and peg box than violins, violas, and cellos. Let's start with the bass. Why do you have gears?
Right. So bass is just a little bit different in general. So this is one of the many ways in which the bass is different. We have gears because the strings are so thick and the tension you're putting on that instrument is so high that if you just had pegs like the violins, violas, or cellos, which are held in with just pressure between the peg box and the pegs themselves. Friction, rather.
That's
the word. Yeah, the friction is what's holding them together. That is not going to work very well on bass, or not at all, really. So we have these gears instead that we use on bass. It functions the same, but you just turn these gears to raise or lower the pitch.
Okay. You just mentioned it, but the violin, viola, cello, no gears. It's just friction. So it's probably important to make sure those things fit really well. Those pegs fit well.
Yeah, it's something you get used to as a string player, but pegs can be kind of a pain, and they can be a challenging thing for students to get used to. And especially violin, viola, also cello, it's really easy to break strings when you're first learning pegs. And that's one of those things that anybody who's had a student teacher, who's had an enthusiastic student try to help out, will know. All of a sudden, you've got like 15 broken strings in your orchestra, and it's crisis time. So there's an art to getting that peg in that peg box and getting the amount of friction that you want in there to hold the instrument. But the general rule of thumb is if you're not sure, go flat, because you're not going to break the string going flat. Yes. You might break it going sharp. And it's always, if you ever have listened to a symphony orchestra tune, or you've ever heard a violinist, a more advanced violinist tune by themselves, you'll always hear that they start flat and then turn that peg up to pitch. It's a really important for many reasons. It tends to make the instrument stay better in tune doing that, but also it's a great safeguard against breaking strings.
Good tip. I like that. And I'll bet you remember, as an orchestra teacher, having some cheap instruments in your orchestra that didn't have pegs that stayed. I bet that was really frustrating.
Yeah, that is the giant headache that is teaching orchestra, and with less quality instruments, all of a sudden you're trying to tune some sort of rickety violin that's just not staying in tune. And even on better instruments, again, weather, the conditions, and lower humidity in particular. That winter comes, they kick on the heat in your building if you're a school teacher, and that dry air is coming out of the vents. All of a sudden, your students pull their instruments out at the beginning of class, and everybody's instruments are flat, like way flat. And then the cellos are one of those tricky things where the pegs, it just takes so much more effort to get those pegs in, to get them tuned and just to stay, that as soon as it gets dry, the pegs start to go, and I'd walk in the cello bass room and I'd see the bridge lying on the floor and all the pegs off, and it's just because it got too dry. And the opposite happens in the summer when it starts to get really humid. The pegs can get really sticky, and that has its own set of challenges.
Okay, good stuff. So just below the pegs in the peg box, we have this little strip of wood that the strings are going over, and it's suspended above the fingerboard. What do you call this thing?
Yeah, that's called the nut. That is, again, that's just a functional piece of the instrument. It's where the strings leave the peg box and join the fingerboard, which we'll talk about soon. A quality nut makes a big difference. Sometimes if you get one that's a little more suspect, they might be a little too tall. They might be the angle might not be quite right. And you can get all sorts of playability problems or even buzzing. And so just having that piece, it looks simple, and it's not probably the most complicated thing on the instrument, but just having those dimensions right, having a decent piece of ebony, which is the wood that's used for those, is really important.
All right. And just below that nut is that long strip of ebony, that black piece of wood. What's that all about?
Yep, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the player's hand actually meets the instrument. That's the one point on the instrument, the fingerboard, where you are actually physically creating the notes between your fingers and that fingerboard, and causing the strings to change in length. So the fingerboard it's what you need to play anything besides open strings. And there's a lot of subtlety in that big black piece of ebony there on the instrument. How it's shaped makes a big difference in terms of how it feels under the player's hands. It makes a big difference in the amount of weight they can put in with the bow. If it's a little too flat, or it's not exactly angled correctly, buzzing can occur. Students or players of any level really might have to work a lot harder to try to play. And there's quite an art to getting these fingerboards right. There's something that's called scoop, and we don't need to go into this too much because it's fairly complicated. perspective, but there's a certain shaping of the fingerboard that's required in order to just have it play evenly. And if that is off, a player might find that way down in the basic positions, what we call first position, it's playable, and then as they go up a little bit, it becomes totally unplayable. So the fingerboard is one of those. It might seem like kind of a subtle thing looking at it, but it's incredibly important how that's shaped, because that really is the player interface for the instrument.
Okay. I want to go back to one thing you said when it creates buzzing if it's not correct. What is buzzing?
Buzzing can come from many places. It's some sort of rattling sound from the stringed instrument. It's something that will drive the player crazy, will drive their teacher crazy, and it's a sign that something is amiss. And if there's a buzz that's just happening on a specific note, especially if you play an open string, it could be that, and often is, that one of the seams, which we haven't talked about yet, but the places where the top and the back and the ribs are joined, it's possible for one of those to come a bit unglued. And that's okay, in fact, because you might think, why don't you just crazy glue the instrument and then it'll never come open? Well, these are wooden instruments do shift a bit with the weather and the climate, and even as they age to a minor extent, and something starts to get too tight or change like that, we want the instrument to be able to pop one of those seams, because it's going to let that tension out somehow, and it could do so by cracking instead. So cracking is bad. Open seams are a bit annoying, but they are easily rectified. So your instrument could be buzzing just from an open seam, or it's from some sort of uneven setup, like the nut being a little bit misshapen, like the fingerboard being a little bit misshapen. Anything that's just a little bit amiss in terms of the construction could cause buzzing. And even though fingerboards are made of ebony and that's a very hard wood, you're still playing metal strings in pretty much every case on a wooden fingerboard. That wood will wear away over time. So fingerboards become a little bit uneven as people play on them, just the natural putting the strings down. So you can start to get buzzing just because you've played your instrument for a while. Then you got to take it in. It's like a tune-up. You take it into a luthier, someone who works on strings, and they can just plane out that fingerboard. You barely even notice, but as soon as you play it, it feels great again.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot to a fingerboard.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so let's follow the strings down the fingerboard, and then the strings go over this, bridge. It looks like a bridge. So tell us about the bridge. This is also kind of a heart and soul of an instrument. Why is that?
Right. Well, the bridge is where the vibrations of these strings, those vibrations are transmitted into the body of the instrument. So yeah, it's a critical piece. And if you want to see how critical, have you play an open string on a string instrument, or have somebody play an open string, and you or another person clamp down and just hold that bridge as the open strings played, and the sound will almost vanish.
No.
If that bridge doesn't vibrate and send those vibrations down, you lose your sound. And so how thick or thin that bridge is, how the bridge is shaped, where it's placed in terms of where in relation to the F holes or the fingerboard and the tailpiece, which we'll talk about in a bit, that all contributes to how the vibrations go into the instrument. So yeah, very important piece of gear. If the bridge falls over, which it does. It's not glued onto the top. It's there. It's just being held on by the pressure of the strings. If that bridge falls over, you want to exercise great caution, because that sound post that we talked about earlier, that is held in place inside the instrument by the pressure of that bridge, the strings on the bridge. If the bridge falls or pops out or something like that, it is possible for that sound post to fall. It doesn't always fall.
Because the pressure is gone.
Yeah, it doesn't always fall. You'll know it falls because you'll hear a little like wooden dowel rolling around the instrument. If that happens, do not put the bridge back on and tighten the strings back. You will damage the instrument. That is when you have your road rep pick it up and take it to their luthier and work on it. It's just something to watch out for. It will fall more frequently on violins. Even if you don't quite have the angle right on the bridge, it's possible for that bridge to, the pressure of the strings over time just cause the bridge to pop out. It's it's kind of surprising. It doesn't do any damage to the instrument, but it's something that you really want to make sure that sound post hasn't shifted. And if it does, you want to take it in and have it professionally set.
Okay, good to know. Is there such a thing as a low quality or high quality bridge?
Yes, for sure. The materials matter a lot. It is, and by the way, the materials of the sound post matter too. Now, those are a lot easier to swap out than the top. you kind of
right.
The top is the top. Except for exceptional circumstances, you kind of got what you got in terms of the body. Now, the bridge, the quality does matter, and cheaper bridges sometimes might come a little bit thicker. And that's just more mass. You don't want more mass. But of course, as soon as you take away mass, you introduce more variables, like the possibility of warping or that sort of thing. And bridges can and do warp over time, particularly if they get set not quite straight. So if you look on the body, that bridge should be coming up from the body at a 90-degree angle. And if it's just a little bit off, you can still play the instrument. But over time, those strings exerting that pressure will cause the wood to start to warp a bit. And that's even more obvious. It's obvious if it happens on any instrument. But if you go into a school with maybe some old cellos or basses, or they haven't been looked after the best, it's very likely to see some warped bridges.
Okay. So what are bridges made of?
They are made of maple, and you want that harder wood, not spruce, but you want that harder wood just to withstand the pressure of the strings on the instrument.
Okay. So let's go down past the bridge where the other end of the strings go into. What's that?
So that is the tailpiece. That is that sort of oddly shaped piece of ebony. Again, in most cases, that's the other spot where the strings are connected. So they're connected up in the peg box, and that's where the tuning happens. Then there's the tailpiece, and that's the other. And in some cases, almost always on a violin E string, sometimes on all the strings, and often on viola and cello, you'll have what are called fine tuners attached to those tailpieces. And those they do what it sounds like. They fine tune. They let you just bring the string a little bit up or a little bit down, because using the pegs that's like a large motion, and particularly with students, those fine tuners are helpful just because it takes some skill to get those pegs working. So you'll sometimes see those attached to the tailpiece as well. The tailpiece is attached to the piece that we'll talk a bit about, I imagine, at the bottom, either the end pin for cello bass or the end button. And there's a cable that connects at the bottom of the tailpiece to that. Now, tailpiece quality, like everything, it makes a difference. And if you go over and hold someone's tailpiece while they're playing, you will hear that sound go away. Not quite as much as the bridge, but it does contribute. It is a relatively easy thing to swap out, though, if you did down the road want to experiment with different tailpieces and building materials. Every wood resonates a little bit differently, and string players sometimes play around with different woods or different shapes. But in most circumstances, it is ebony, and it does add to some of the resonance of the instrument.
Right. And so this is a question I get fairly often. So basic beginning instruments, they have 4 fine tuners. Nicer instruments, the higher priced instruments, only have 1. Why is that?
Well, the more you can have the strings directly joined to the body of the instrument, generally the better the resonance of the instrument is going to be. So those strings attached to the tailpiece are going to just have a bit of a bigger sound. That is the idea anyway. And that it might not actually be as big a deal as people think. It's almost kind of like a badge of pride to get those removed. But that you'll notice that there's still one for that top string. And that's just because those violin E strings in particular, it's really easy to break them. And just not having to use the peg for that and get those fine, just getting it a couple cents sharper or flatter, that sort of thing. Having that one up there is useful. And the fact that on the violin that top string is just it is typically not wound like the other strings. I think the theory is that it doesn't quite matter so much how it's joined to the body. That's the word on the street anyway.
Okay. So just over the tailpiece, we have on violins and violas. Now this does not apply to cellos and basses. I'll just throw out there, we have the chin rest, and there's literally your chin rests on it. And there's various different shapes and types and styles of chin rest. And it turns out that it's actually kind of a personal thing. You talk to different teachers and players, and you look at their violins and violas, and they look different. Not everybody has the same exact style of chin rest. We won't go into all the terms of what the various ones are called, but just know that there's a lot of different kinds of chin rests out there, and don't be surprised if you have a teacher asking for a specific style because that's their preference, and that's pretty normal.
Yep.
So Jason, let's go on to something called setup. What in the world is a setup? You hear that mentioned quite a bit.
Yeah, it's that combination of all those things that are easier to alter. The box of the instrument, the resonating cavity, the top, ribs, and back, that's much more of a fixed quantity. You're not just going to go in and say, hey, swap out my ribs, unless something terrible happened to the instrument and it needs to be totally rebuilt. Setup refers to what kind of strings are on that instrument. What is the angle of that bridge exactly, and where is that bridge in proportion to the fingerboard, the edge of the fingerboard versus the tailpiece? Moving that bridge around a millimeter or two can have an impact on how it plays. That nut that I was referring to, how tall is that? How are the grooves where the strings line up? How are those shaped? Even the pegs, and then certainly the fingerboard, how is that planed? How is that angle getting the angle of that bridge? It needs to have a relationship to the shape of the fingerboard. And so when you get a setup, that luthier will take and will look and examine that angle and that player's needs and just make sure that all those dimensions are in line. And like I said earlier, over time, fingerboards do start to show some wear just from normal playing. No matter what you do, that's just how it goes. And so getting that replaned and getting that all set up, that's something that is just done on a regular basis. Luthiers like to say, think about it's kind of like going in for a checkup with the doctor, or like taking your car in for a regular maintenance or something like that. You need to take the instrument in every once in a while. You want to have those things looked at. Setup also refers to where the sound post is. That's a big one too. So all those things that we can adjust on the instrument, those all contribute to form what we say setup.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Does everybody have the same setup?
No. It differs for sure, and it depends on the kind of playing you do and the type of player you are, and the differences become more pronounced in terms of the dimensions and everything as you get into the bigger instruments, just because there's more instruments. So some people like a little bit more of a rounded fingerboard. Some people like a little bit of a flatter fingerboard, just a little bit. Some people like what's called a bevel in the fingerboard, where the low string is almost set off on a different angle. There are all sorts of things in terms of setup. Bass is my main instrument, and for bassists, a big question is, are you a jazz player primarily? Are you an orchestral player primarily? And how high off the fingerboard the strings are, the type of strings you're going to use, all of that changes a lot for bass players, but really for all string players, depending on the type of playing that they predominantly do.
Okay. So having the ability at a music store to be flexible with what kind of setup you're offering to teachers sounds pretty important.
For sure, yeah.
So hopefully, by our description of all of these various parts, you have a better understanding of what each one does, what it's made of, why it's there. And I want to encourage you, if you want to learn more, there are lots of great diagrams online you can go see that have names and arrows pointing to all of these various different parts. And it's really good to memorize the names of these parts so that when teachers are talking about them, you know basically what they're talking about and why it's there, what its function is. It also gives you confidence when talking to teachers about string instruments. And I feel like the more you know, the more empowered you feel, and the more comfortable you are in the orchestra room. Jason, thanks for your time today.
You bet, Shane. Anytime. Pleasure.
We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.